Welcome to Supersizing Bliss, the podcast, where I, Toby Witte, read from my book, Supersizing Bliss, How We Have Betrayed Our Homes and the Happiness We Seek. In the last chapter, The Luxury of Access, I mentioned smarter ways of living than single-family homes. One such way is co-housing. Kyle Barker is the founder of Primary Projects, a Boston-based architecture firm with a commitment to more communal, affordable, and sustainable housing. He is a member of the Design Advisory Council for the Cohousing Association of the United States and has taught several housing studios at Northwestern University. As a recipient of the Roach Traveling Scholarship, he traveled across Europe, Australia, and Japan to study collective housing models. He's currently working on a book on the subject. All right, Kyle, what exactly is co-housing?
Yeah, so it's funny. The word co-housing has this really specific codified meaning in the US. I'll give you kind of my take on it, and then, the more kind of legislative version of that. I think of co-housing as just being a more communal form of living. I think in many ways it's a return to how people lived throughout history. In your book, you talk a lot about the single family home and some of the challenges of that. I think most people in the United States think of single family homes as like the predominant type of way we live, and almost as if it's this inevitable way of living. But that really only came on in a big way since the post-war era. People returning with the GI Bill and building out Levittown and these other sort of historical things. So when you go back further than that, it's really interesting to see how people lived. And so in many ways, I think co-housing is just kind of a return to a living that reinforces mutuality and support. Some of the physical traits that co-housing tends to have in the United States is it's typically about 30 units. They share a common house. So that's the term they use. And that is usually a large building on the property where people share meals. So different communities have different relationships with it, but many organize cooking programs. And so the residents will alternate cooking for the entire community. Sometimes that's as infrequently as holidays, but in some communities that I visited, that happens 5 nights a week. And then that building also houses other things like a place to do your laundry. So often they don't have units within laundry units within their individual units. That's all shared in the common house. That can have a lot of other things like co-working space, playrooms for kids. I think that's sort of physically how it looks. It looks different between urban and rural places, but I think the other key thing is that it's designed intentionally in a way to foster community through the way you circulate through. In an urban setting, that might be like a single loaded corridor, meaning that there's units on one side and it's open to the other so that you can see people as they move from their unit to the common house or from their unit to their car, which a typical trait, whether it's rural or urban, is that cars are parked around the perimeter, so that it's less car centric and more people centric. But in rural settings, often, there is a pathway that all of the units are sort of organized around. So
Mhm.
inevitably, you bump into people in a way that you wouldn't in a traditional kind of suburban neighborhood.
So, do I imagine though, like visually, in an urban
Mhm.
setting, it would be visually sort of similar to a multi-unit residential building, except that the way it's designed internally is how you describe it. But then you're saying in the rural setting, it would be more of separate buildings of the individual units and the common house in the center or somewhere.
Yeah, so there are a few different organizational patterns that are typical, but yeah, in an urban setting, I say 30 units. There are two people in the US, so Charles Durrett and Catherine McCammett, or Chuck and Katie. They studied these Danish models and brought them to the United States, and they're actually the ones that came up with the term co-housing. So in Danish, my Danish is terrible, but it's something around like bofilskape, which translates to living community. And so they went and studied these models. I believe it was the early 80s, brought them back and came up with this term co-housing. In their definition, it's usually about 30 units. There are communities that go in both directions in terms of scale. but often in an urban setting, like you're saying, it does look much like a normal multifamily building, but usually they're like an L or a U shape so that they bracket that outdoor space. They can also be a courtyard configuration, but that they bracket an outdoor space that's shared. So the residents will garden together. Often part of co-housing is that people do the property management as a collective. So there's some cost savings there. And then in the rural settings, yeah, the I have seen it a bunch of different ways, but typically the common house is located in a spot where it is somewhat equidistant from the units that surround it. And there's a lot of different building types that can be co-housing.
Mhm.
Certainly, ones in rural settings can look like multifamily buildings, but often they take on more of a village character. Sometimes they're like a row house almost, where they're connected, though they have shared walls. Sometimes they're kind of like a duplex style that gets aggregated, or a triplex, or so
Okay.
units will share a little bit of wall as a cost saving measure. And one thing
Okay.
that's critical that I forgot to mention was that although they share these extensive common facilities, each unit has its own stuff as well. So the units tend to be smaller than you would think of as a typical American single family home, but they do have functional kitchens, their own living space, bedrooms, etc.
So how do I then have to imagine life in a co-housing setup? So does it differ much of so most of us live? So it sounds like I have my own unit, my own private space, bedrooms, whatever, even sometimes kitchen, you're saying. But then we have that communal space that we might decide to whatever dinners together, maybe not every day, maybe every day. Or how does it kind of look like? And I guess
Yeah,
the question with that would also be, so what's the benefits then of living in a co-housing space?
I think that it appeals to people for different reasons. If I was going to put it into a few buckets, I would say, well, I think people go to this type of housing because they are looking for community in a different way than they're experiencing it in the neighborhood they live in. I think functionally, these developments operate off of a consensus model most of the time. So the group will meet, it depends on the group, but usually weekly. Sometimes it's as infrequently as like monthly, but they'll meet to make decisions together. There's any kind of purchases that need to happen, if there's any conversations that need to happen around, conflicts between neighbors, usually they have different teams that look after parts of it. So there'll be kind of like a maintenance team and a fun team, and they might break it into like six or seven with people self-assigning for what they're interested in, but they make decisions in a democratic way. And so sometimes it's consensus based, or some groups have adopted like consensus -1 or consensus -2. But a lot of groups now are organizing in a sociocratic framework, which is there's a thing called sociocracy. It is about reaching consensus, but I think if any of you have ever been in a group where you're trying to reach consensus, you know how that can be very challenging. And so sociocracy is, there are people that are like practitioners of this and trained people. So I'm trying to do my best to just get their message out there. But it's like a form of decentralized decision making where a larger group breaks down into, they call them circles, but they're more or less groups that have responsibility for a specific domain. And then that all kind of rolls up into one centralized group so that everybody knows what's going on, but not everybody has to be part of every decision.
Mhm.
Um, I think that gets a little bit into how decisions are made and how these groups function, kind of in a day-to-day way. But I think the benefits and kind of who chooses to live here is a little bit different. I think older people are often interested because I think many people hit a point in life where they may have lost a partner, or it may just be that they've retired and they're starting a new chapter. And so they're, looking for community in a more intentional way. I think there's, of course, mutual support that happens in these communities. And so I
Mhm.
think they can be a great place to age. And also, it can be a nice way of interacting across generations. Of course, a lot of older people have grandchildren and things like that. but not everyone does. And sometimes those people live very far away. So this
Hmm.
can be a way of sort of having younger people in your life in a day-to-day way. I think co-housing is incredibly appealing to families, especially families with children, because I think a lot of people are like pining for a time when kids could just run free
Mm.
and, had autonomy. I think
Yeah,
this is a way of creating that. I mean, I have a lot of friends with kids and they want to have their kids run free, but then every time they try to do that, there's another parent
yeah.
who intercedes and
So,
creates a problem. So in co-housing, it's very different, right?
yeah,
Like there's a built-in network for your children
I
and there's
see.
sort of a safe place to hang out.
So I picture then essentially that in a very natural way, I live my own life, I have my own private space, but those moments that do want to be shared are easier to share. I have there are the grandparent types that can babysit, if you will. My kids can run outside and play with the other kids, and I see them all there in the common areas or whatever. I don't know, and whatever else happens in these kind of overlapping of these, shared experiences, I guess.
There are so many cute stories of those kinds of things. And I think I was just listening. Well, when I went on this trip, which I think we'll talk about later, but I visited some communities in Denmark. And one of the women who was living there, who was single and, in the midst of her career, she said that one of the kids in the community who's little had just, she's essentially like a surrogate aunt. And the kid, sometimes she'll come back to her unit and the child is just sleeping in her bed. So she said, this is Denmark, so they also like have slightly different cultural norms than we do. I mean,
Sure.
similar in many ways. But
Yeah.
she said she'll just like wake them up and take them back to their parents. There are American communities I know of where, like you're saying, it's young parents who just want a night on the town, and so they'll ask a neighbor if they can look after their child while they're gone, and it's just a much more casual, sort of easy thing to do when you're living in a community than, the
Very cool.
typical experience of hiring a babysitter.
Yeah. That begs the question, how does a community or a co-housing thing, what is this called? A conglomerate or whatever? How does it get started? Is it driven by a developer? Is it driven by the individual people? How does it kind of work? And how do the is the financial picture around that, I guess?
There's a few key elements to co-housing, and I mentioned a few of them, like the common house, the parking around the perimeter. There's generally around certain sizes. Also, resident participation in the creation is thought to be part of it. And I say thought to be part of it, like there are some great books on co-housing mostly by Chuck and Katie, who I mentioned earlier. There are some models where it has been developer led and they have created a vision and then they've sold the units. I think I go back and forth on if there's a better or a right way to do this. I think that at this time where we're all experiencing such kind of acute affordability issues, I would say a crisis, I think it's okay to be doing things in different ways. And so I can see value actually in both. Like I think when you have a participatory process, I think the positive of that is that people are involved, engaged, they can kind of tailor things to their desires as a community. I think the pitfall of that is that because when these groups form, often no one in them or very few of the people have experience with construction, that it can be a little bit meandering and a lot of times a pretty long process where, of course, people lose enthusiasm along the way. And so the group kind of changes over time. I think the other potential pitfall of that model is that people, because your living space is so personal,
Mm.
understandably, people want to personalize their units, and that adds a significant amount of cost. I think the positive of the developer models are kind of like the inversion of that. The positive is that you can streamline the costs, which can make things more affordable if the developer passes that on to the residents. And I think the con is that, you don't have a sort of ready group to buy those units. You have to market to people. And although to me, it doesn't seem like it should be that unique of a of a clientele you're looking for because, there's like record levels of loneliness in the US at the moment. Like there's in many ways this feels like a model that just feels very intuitive. I think that in the US, we have this sort of historical hangover of like a reaction to hippiness and like so I think that this kind of movement has these like associations in the American psyche that we're still sort of getting over. But I do see like a younger generation that doesn't seem to have those hangups in the same way. So it'll be
Yeah.
interesting to see kind of how it plays out over the next, however many years.
Sounds low, but in either case, the individual parties that form the group or buy into you, either through a developer or as a group, you essentially own a piece. It's like a condo setup, if you will. So you own it, your piece, and maybe some kind of shared value in the common areas, common spaces, that you can at a later point buy into or sell if life changes.
Yeah,
So you're an owner essentially.
so that's a typical model. There are rental models, but the most common is, as you're saying, like a condo structure. And that is certainly easy for banks to understand. So
Mhm.
that's a positive. Um, I am really interested in limited equity cooperatives, which that can be something that goes on to kind of almost any form of housing. It's more about like the legal structure and less about how the living itself is organized. And I don't feel fully qualified to like get into the weeds on that. But the kind of lay person's understanding is that, like most cooperatives, you collectively own the asset, you have the right to occupy your unit, and
Mhm.
that comes with a certain amount of shares in the ownership structure or a percentage share. And then when you sell, you make some of the equity off of that
Mm.
sale, but it's capped at a certain levels to preserve affordability in the community. Any kind of cooperative structure typically means if you're an owner, you have a vote. So I think that's kind of like just part of co-housing. So that's less of a deal as it relates to co-housing. But I was just at a conference and I heard a talk all about cooperatives and it just like reignited, my excitement around kind of rethinking housing as a commodity, which I know you've done a lot of thinking on as well.
As an architect, what fascinates you about this? I mean, it sounds like certainly from just a living arrangement, that communal idea, not being alone, having shared experiences, having people, like-minded people around you. Sounds like just for me as a customer, as a consumer or whatever, as a somebody who wants to live somewhere, it sounds wonderful. But so as an architect, are there certain design sort of excitements baked into this that are kind of interesting to you?
It's a great question. I mean, certainly everything you said is appealing to me. I started my practice primary projects about 3 years ago with the intent of focusing on more communal, affordable, and sustainable housing. Because I think in the United States, we have the single family housing, which, 75% of our country is zoned to incentivize that. So that doesn't need an advocate. It's got, it's like our entire economy is based on housing starts, and that's thought of as single family house. So like that has enough people pulling for it. And then multifamily housing, which has a lot of barriers with, not in my backyardism or what people call NIMBYism. I mean, there's just like a million challenges for multifamily. But typically the way multifamily is built in the US is developer driven, profit motivated. It's luxury product. That's not really about community or the environment or quality. It's about, a return on investment. And I don't say that just critically. I think there's a lot of risk. Developers take on a ton of risk in doing multifamily. So I understand why they feel like they need to make a return on that. But to me, between those two kind of extremes, there's just this whole spectrum of people that aren't served by either of those models. And so even just looking at it from a person perspective, it seems like these models don't really capture intergenerational housing. They don't really capture people who want to live in community in one way or another. I think in that sort of way, from a social movement perspective, I thought this seems important. And then I think environmentally, in your book, you talk about just how single family homes are pretty resource intensive, even if they are net zero or, carbon negative. Like there's there's this sort of almost no version of that model that is truly sustainable. Whether it's rural or urban co-housing, I do get excited about the kind of density of use, the sharing that goes on. I think one of the pros of living in a community like this is that you can, share the lawnmower with 30 other people. You can have one snow blower. You can, a lot of the sort of redundancy that happens in the United States gets pushed away. I think that's another thing that excited me was I think often when we think about affordability, we think about austerity, like how can we give someone less so that they can have something? And I think that one of the exciting things about this way of living is that I think it has the potential to give people something different that's actually maybe better and in some ways more luxurious, almost even decadent, but rooted in community. I think that's what's drawn me to the work. And then there's a bunch of, you and I could nerd out about the sort of architecture-y stuff that is exciting to think about. It's always fun to explore something that feels like new territory in architecture. And I think what I've realized over the last few years, going on this trip around the world to check out co-housing and similar models, is that, in some ways, like it's all been done in quotes, but then that's actually even more exciting to me because it's this like legacy that you can learn from and build on.
Talk about your trip. So
Yeah.
where did you go and what did you see?
A few years ago, I won a design competition. It's called the Roach Traveling Scholarship. And so it paid for me to travel abroad and research a topic of my choosing. I chose to focus on communal housing models, and I visited over 55 communities across 10 countries. And during the trip, I met with architects, the architects who had designed the buildings, with people that lived in them. I took more than 12,000 photos, which is far too many. I so that was the past 2 summers. So it was a total of 3 months of traveling. And I just finished compiling my insights into this book, which if podcasts were a visual medium, your audience could see this. Um,
Communal Housing Design Guidelines.
yeah. So, and the subtitle is Principles for More Affordable, Sustainable, and Social Multifamily Dwellings. In the book, I share 40 lessons that I learned along the way. And each of them is illustrated with the photos that I took, which the point is to show kind of a spectrum of options for implementing these 40 lessons. I broke them down into categories. I talk about circulation, economy, storage, flexibility, privacy, expression, and inclusion. And I don't know, this is like such a book in the architecture world, but A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander and his collaborators was like a big inspiration for the book. So anyway, yeah, the trip was incredibly transformative. Trying to figure out how to capture the lessons just felt like such an undertaking, both for myself, but I really thought like this is such a special once in a lifetime opportunity that I would love to find a way to share this with other people. So that was really like the inspiration for creating the book. I'm like talking with publishers at the moment, but I just presented it at the biennial co-housing conference, which was in Denver this past 2 weekends ago. It was
Oh,
exciting to
cool.
kind of put it out in the world
Yeah.
for the first time.
What countries did you pick your head in?
It was very, in a way, like very city based. So I feel like in some ways saying the country, then people are gonna be like,
Okay.
oh, did you go here? So maybe I'll just say the cities. So I went to Barcelona, Marseille, Bern, Zurich, Vienna, Berlin, Copenhagen, Stockholm, Melbourne. Those were the ones that were most kind of critical to the research. As an architect who happened to be, near other cities, I ended up going to Sydney as well and Oslo.
Super cool. So that means also the co-living, co-housing units you saw were stuck in different cultural settings. Were there some real memorable moments or places where you went and you were like just amazed? I've never ever seen, I don't know what, people sharing a kitchen, or I don't know what it might be that where you would,
Yeah.
oh my God, this is so incredible. Or maybe the physical
Yeah.
manifestation of it, or something that blew your mind.
There's a few different ways I can answer that question, and maybe I'll just start by saying part of my selection criteria was places that have similar building codes to us, because
Mhm.
I wanted the lessons to be somewhat transferable. What's interesting about that is even in cultures that have similar building codes, there are these like glaring differences. So in the United States with multifamily buildings, as soon as you go over pretty much like 3 stories, you have to have 2 fire stairs. And that's just not the case in almost anywhere else I went. So it'd be these like 8 or 9 story buildings with a single stair, which as an American architect, I'm incredibly envious of because I think that they're still safe, but you can just do so much more with like solar orientation and light into units on both sides and whatever. Here you end up with like having to design big buildings, kind of like a hotel where they have rooms on
Oh,
both sides of a hallway, so you can only get light from one side. But my gripe about our codes aside, there were a few things that jumped out on the trip. There's a project in Berlin called R50 that is just like it feels like the purest distillation of like the kind of thing I would love to build. Everything in it is just like sort of has to be there. It was incredibly budget driven. And so every choice does like it like checks 4 boxes simultaneously. Trying to think of a good example of that. For their fire code, they had to have, I think it was 2 ways to access the single stair in the building. And so the way they achieved that was they did like a very minimal, I think it's 2.5 feet wide balcony that goes around all 4 sides of the building. So each floor has about 3 units, and each unit can leave from pretty much any one of their rooms, bedroom, living space, whatever, to get onto this balcony, and then can enter back from 2 points to get to that stair. Solved a fire code issue, but when you see the building, it just feels like, wow, this just has these lovely communal balconies that
mhm.
create a space for people. The guy I interviewed was like smoking while we chatted, and he made espresso for us. And everybody has plants out there, but it also, it does some like solar shading for the units, both passively, but then there are shades that can be pulled down on the outside. So it's just like every decision just felt incredibly thoughtful. The Danish ones are incredible. Most of the ones that I saw were in rural settings. That's where like co-housing started. There's a firm called Van Kunsten. The work that they did in the late 70s and 80s is just like they still exist and they still do really great work. But those projects for me are like I just return to again and again. There's two years specific. Am I going on too long?
No, it's fine. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. The one that really just jumps out is so if you imagine this development, it's sort of like an L shape. So the
Hmm.
common house is at like the elbow of the L, the joint, and then there's 2 bars that extend off of that. And what those bars are is it's kind of like row houses on both sides of a wide hallway. So they
Hmm.
face each other. The space between, which would normally be like an outdoor street or something, is enclosed in glass. So it's effectively a greenhouse, which is just, the circulation and architecture terms is so generous that it just becomes this amazing living room space. And because Denmark is pretty cold in the winter, it's this incredible, like all year room for them. They grow grapevines in there. So they said they make their own wine. They said it's terrible, but it's fun. They had sandboxes in there for the kids. They had all kinds of seating and stuff. But it's just like such a unusual living experience. And to your earlier question of like, was there anything that just blew my mind from that inner street that's, covered, there are these huge windows into everybody's kitchens. And so, as you're walking down, you can just look right into someone's kitchen, they're at their table eating, right? So that is like as an American, that just feels incredibly just
Intrusive.
different. Yeah. But I think they see that as just an extension of that sort of shared living room. And
Yeah.
so there are incredibly private spaces in the units. The bedrooms are tucked away, but even that space, you can draw a blind and so you have privacy. And they said that people use that as a way of conveying how social they're feeling.
Wow.
If you draw
Yeah.
that blind, you still have light coming in from the other side of that room. And so some of them were drawn when I was there, but most of them were open. Many of them even had their doors open. This was the place where the woman said that the little one just climbed in her bed, and that's because she
Yeah.
just leaves her door open all the time. You know,
Yeah.
yeah.
That
As an
is
American, that was like really
yeah.
kind of mind blowing.
But that's incredible. That kind of blows apart open the whole idea of sort of what are private spaces, what are public spaces, what are sort of semi-shared spaces. I mean, just the idea that my kitchen and my dining room, where we come together as a family, let's say, we kind of open that up to our other families, people, units around us through that common street, common hallway kind of space, where there's a whole nother layer of sharing and being part of a greater sort of community. But like you're describing, you can, when that goes too far, I close the blind, or
Yep.
from there, even I assume, even more private spaces where nobody, you're on your own,
Yeah.
and yeah, that is incredible. Just with the risk of spreading this too far, but are there then some, mentioned it a little bit, but some sustainable factors, things that benefit from this kind of setup? I mean, like you mentioned already, I suppose there is a, saving of resources, overlapping resources, that, you create once for everybody to use, I suppose. I guess you
Yeah.
talked also about this sort of direction to the sun in some instances. Yeah, there's some benefits like that, that this co-housing kind of setup actually makes life easier if you want to create a building more sustainable, or a group of buildings.
I mean, I would just say yes to that. Like, I think there's the sharing that happens, as you mentioned. And then I think, just like any time you're reducing the amount of exterior of a building, or like what architects would call the envelope, I think, that has benefits in terms of it's a little climate dependent, but how much of your conditioned interior space is essentially like leaking out into the world. And I think there's some efficiencies with like mechanical, electrical, plumbing, like all of that stuff. I think there's like an economy of scale to that. And certainly when you're comparing it to single family homes, especially in rural areas where each one might have its own septic system and, it's kind of like single use. I think that a lot of times co-housing in rural areas is able to like share those systems across many more people. I just wanted to say too that like I mentioned earlier that I care about sustainable, affordable, communal. And so for me, co-housing is like one type that fits underneath that. And I think that the way we've defined it in the US as 30 units, common house, I feel happy that that exists as a type. And I think we need more innovation. Like I think I want that to persist. So, but I also am interested in other forms. I think one thing that's come up a lot is like, and this gets into language policing a bit, but there's like co-housing, which is what we've been talking about. There's co-living, which is what like WeWork tried to do with We Live, if you remember that. But
Mhm.
that's more like typically it's targeted at urban nomads, and it's, you rent a bedroom in a building that has extensive common facilities. That's tended to be like a more developer profit-driven motive that seems to be more about convenience, maybe a little bit less about community. Those are the most popular, or maybe the most known. I'm also interested in things like intergenerational housing,
Mhm.
which I think that conversation has gotten more lively with a lot of places around the United States passing accessory dwelling unit or ADU legislation over the last few years. But I'm also interested in types that we haven't even discovered yet, you know?
Nice.
So
That's awesome. I love that. Can you paint a picture of where all of this seems to be in the United States and is going? And if you can kind of lay that out, are we picturing that there's two of these, one in Seattle and one in Washington, D.C. or something, or are there a million of these? And what do you expect in the next sort of decade or so to happen? What's your expectation for this? It sounds like a really fascinating setup. Oh, by the by, before you
Mhm.
answer this, I was just thinking, in order to kind of promote this, there should be a sitcom or something. Seems like a perfect setting for just the most wonderful stories to kind of develop between all of these sort of participants living
Yeah,
together.
yeah, agreed. Like the Melrose Place of today.
Uh-huh.
Um, well, I should fact check myself on this, but I was just at the conference and they put the number in front of me. I'm going to say I think there's about 150 of these co-housing communities
Wow.
spread across the US. There's definitely a density in the western part, West Coast-ish. But there are a lot in Massachusetts. I think there's four now in the Boston area and a few in other parts of the state. So, and at the conference, I think they said there's 120 that are currently like seeking to build communities
Wow.
around the country. So I do think it feels a bit like a kind of evergreen thing. I think that it seems like young people are looking for creative ways to continue community. I mean, for those people that are fortunate enough to go to college, I think that often people, when they start working, experience like a decline in community. I think, a younger generation is interested in this. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are older generations that are interested for kind of different reasons. Obviously, as an architect who kind of focuses on things in this world and feels passionate about it, I might have a biased perspective. I do think that I'm optimistic that the sort of current challenges we're facing around affordability, loneliness, the environment kind of naturally point us in this direction.
That's incredible. Very cool. Well, last question would be really, is there something that I didn't ask about or you didn't mention yet that you have on your chest that everybody should know about co-housing we haven't touched yet?
Hmm, it's a good question. Well, maybe this is in the spirit of earlier what I was saying about co-housing is like one housing model I'm interested in of many that are at neither end of the spectrum being single family and multifamily developer driven. I didn't mention this earlier when you asked communities, it jumped out at me, but there's a model in Melbourne in Australia that I wish the US would just like grab onto. It was started by a firm there called Breathe Architecture. That's a very cool firm that you should check out. Okay. I'm just going to try to distill this into the most, kind of meaningful part of it. There's a whole history of it that's super interesting to check out. But I think the short version is that they established some principles of what I would call kind of like ethical housing development. These would vary a bit by your climate, but in their climate, they kind of looked at the pro forma of housing and they said, okay, how can we make this as sustainable as possible and more affordable and also communal? So it's like the three things I care about. And so they looked at the kind of line by line of the pro forma, and these are all in, not all, but the first ones were all in Melbourne. And so they said, okay, it's a very urban setting. We have access to transit, good biking. Let's get rid of the car parking. And that's a tough sell for anybody that does housing. That's a big ask. And municipalities are getting better, but that was the first thing. They thought if we could get rid of that, we save a lot of money on building that out. We can build some mixed use kind of commercial spaces on the ground floor. They thought, well, we're not going to do more than one bathroom per unit, even when they're two beds, because that is essentially like a luxury and it's a very expensive one. So we're going to cut that out. They didn't use air conditioning. So they found a way in Australia, which is meaningful, to condition the spaces passively. And so they do have ceiling fans, but they paid a lot of attention to the way that air flows through the space and making it feel cool. And so there were a bunch of things like that where they just kind of went line by line very thoughtfully. They've been able to build, I mean, it's so many at this point. When I was in Australia, I visited, I think, nine of them, and they're usually between 20 and 40 units. The ground floor is commercial. Above that are fairly repetitive stacks of units. They don't often feel that way because they do a great job of kind of disguising that repetition so that they don't look monotonous. They're like very well designed. And then the rooftop is where many communal things are. And again, being very thoughtful about cost and unit sizes and the relationship between those two things. None of the units have their own laundry. So there's shared laundry on the roof. None of them have their own bathtub. So in some of them, there is a shared bath house on the roof that you can like reserve to use if you have children or if that's your preference. So what I love about it is that the rooftop is this active communal space because there's no avoiding it. Like everybody has to do their laundry. And so it's so cute because they have these laundry rooms next to these drawing lines, next to a hangout space, and they have a good climate. But I just love the whole ethos of these buildings because they've been able to deliver housing initially below market rate. Now I think they're tracking at market rate because of the kind of cost challenges that we've all faced. But they also are incredibly communal vibes without going to the common house model of co-housing, where you're building kind of a commercial building and sharing the cost. So I will say that like co-housing tends to be market rate because even though your unit is smaller, you're building more extensive common facilities. So I think that the Nightingale model, I think, is an interesting riff on it, where it's capturing a lot of those, a lot of like the good things of co-housing and kind of rethinking it for a different context in a really thoughtful way. And they worked with like just some of the best architects in the world, so that's also fun. It was fun to see the buildings because they're all just so like thoughtfully and beautifully designed.
Wonderful. Well, it's a great note to end on. I love it. That's awesome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's exciting. I'm excited that you're doing this, and I'm looking forward to listening to all the episodes.
Yeah, wonderful. It was fantastic to have you, Colin. I really appreciate your expertise and insights to all of this. And I do know that many people will be excited to kind of hear about this. And it's so nice to listen to you. You're just wonderful way to share and paint a picture.
If people want more, they should follow me on LinkedIn because I post weekly like a housing thing that's generally inspiring. Sometimes they're a little sad because the world of multifamily housing can be a downer sometimes. But I try to post mostly uplifting things and innovations from around the world. I also post to Instagram. It's just primary_projects. That I've been a little bit less consistent with, but trying to get back on the old horse.
Very cool. Well, definitely check that out, folks. And I'll certainly leave the links in the show notes as well. There you have it, folks. Boston architect Kyle Barker on co-housing. You can find out more about Kyle and his firm, Primary Projects, on their website, primaryprojects.org. I will leave the link and a connection to his LinkedIn profile in the show notes. I'm your host, Toby Witte, author of Supersizing Bliss, How We Have Betrayed Our Homes and the Happiness We Seek. Please go to supersizingbliss.com to order a copy of my book and find more information. When I don't talk to you, I design sexy, modern, sustainable homes in North and South Carolina and adjacent areas. Subscribe, leave a comment, and click on the links in the show notes.